Hello again, and here we are to talk about language development in preschoolers, but I'm also going to go way back and talk a little bit about infancy as well, only because we skipped it a little bit last week, just because it's kind of interesting to talk about this all together. So, let's just look at this. One of the things that is interesting about um, when human beings are learning to speak is their parents speak to them. People talk to babies in a specific way, and it's called infant directed speech, sometimes called motherese. But it's obviously not limited to mothers. Fathers do it, siblings do it. But it involves um, altering the way that you speak to little babies. And you can feel yourself doing it. It's like, oh, your voice gets higher. And what I thought was interesting, I got this from a different textbook that I think is really interesting. And it basically shows that um, every language basically has a form of infant directed speech. And in this case, this is just comparing English and Spanish. And, what do they have in common and in what order? So they basically observed um, people in each language talking to infants, and then did a bit of a uh, ordered the frequency of these different behaviors. So both English and Spanish have an exaggerated intonation. That's what exaggerated, where you really draw it out and you make everything very exaggerated. In English, there's a breathiness and a high pitch, and repetition. Uh, there's So there tends to be softer, longer vowels, creaky voice, instructional, where we describe how something's working. There's a bit of a tenseness in our voice. We go falsetto, right? So when we talk to babies, this is sort of, by we, I mean us English speaking Americans tend to be like this. And if you happen to be bilingual or maybe brought up in a Spanish speaking household, your infant directed speech might be just slightly different. You're still going to be repetitive. You're still going to have exaggerated intonation and high pitch. You may spend more time being instructional, attentionals. You may also have lower volume and a raised volume going back and forth, and speak even very fast. Um, there's also this issue of personal pronoun substitution, which is actually a really interesting and fascinating thing to study about preschooler language development. But it's too complicated for our class right now. It's something that I'm studying a little bit about in my grad school studies. But I wanted to give you a look at Mother E's from around the world. And so I give you this link. And I'm not going to at all listen to all of these. Maybe if we were in class, I would. But this page just has a whole bunch of video clips from people from Vietnam. Here's a family in China. Here's Spanish. I think this might even be Spain Spanish. Here's in French, Italian, German. The dog. That's just a joke. But you can see how this infant directed speech plays out in different languages. And when we're talking about infant language, just to focus in on this phase, there's the pre-language, which involves eye contact and facial expressions and babbling and crying out. And then there are the first words, which occur between 10 and 14 months. Usually there's one initial word that often refers to objects or states that reappear. So the first word is often something that is seen again and again. Often it's mama or a dada but I remember the first word for an object that my son had was dabwa, dabwa. And he would say it for basically everything that he liked. And over time, we began to see that dabwa meant car, because he'd stand at the window. We had really low windows that looked straight out onto a street in New York City, and he'd look and he'd say Dabwa. He'd be fascinated at the cars going by. And nouns are the most common. Um, and in some ways, when we think about what we just talked about with Piaget, like nouns are objects, right? So in some ways, you can think about how Piaget, he was not full of crap. He knew that the mind is moving toward an interaction with objects. But at the same time, some of our first words are for the people in our lives, or the dogs, or the beings. The first sentences that occur happen usually around 18 months, and they're two-word phrases, usually descriptive. Telegraphic, that means there's no and the. It's just, Mommy sit, Daddy mean. Well, hopefully nobody's saying that. There's also underextension and overextension rules, or undergeneralization and overgeneralization. But I wanted to really show you this video. This is pre-language. This is almost language. It's so close. So these twins are talking to each other, and they're using a lot of the conventions of language. Listen to the intonation, and you're going to see that it sounds like a real conversation. But there's no words at all. It's hilarious. I love it. Let's hope I don't get an ad. I did. Okay, that's enough of that. So how adorable, right? Like, there they are. They're waving their hands. They're asking questions. Da 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 da. And then the other baby's laughing. He seems to be responding with something to do with his foot. And it's something about having only one sock on. Who knows? But they're certainly enjoying each other's presence, and they're communicating to each other that who knows what they're saying, but they're definitely responding, going back and forth. And one will wave his hand, oh, no, 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 and shake his head. So they're using a lot of pre-language in this clip. So there are milestones in learning language involving both the vocalization and speech, what gets said, and also what gets understood. That's what these two charts are. And so this basically, it starts with one syllable, goes with cooing, babbling, clear vocalizations, 2 syllables, first word, first 5 words, 2 words in combination, first pronoun. Like, a pronoun's a big deal. It's kind of like symbolic thought, but not entirely. And similarly, comprehension goes up over time. And this gives you a sense of like how many months you are when you understand prepositions like in and under. Those are the first prepositions that you understand. But that's like 2 years old. So it's kind of interesting to think about language development over this infant time span, which we've already studied. But now I'm going to take you into another way of looking at the language development all the way through to 4 years. And this is drawn from a scholar named Hoff. in which it was something I studied in my grad school stuff. And they broke down language in terms of communication, the intentional, the range of communicative purpose, like why you're conversing. Conversational initiative and responsiveness grows at 2 years. Your narrative skills develop. You're able to tell stories by 4 years. Phonology, those are the sounds that you're making. Vocal play, babbling. Now you're reorganizing these phonological representations by 1 year. You have a phonetic inventory completion. So right around here, what that means is right right about between 2.5 and 3 years old, uh, the the sounds that you are going to use in your language are sort of baked. And in the beginning, prior to that, you can hear any sound in any language and distinguish it. But over time, right around here, you stop hearing the sounds that aren't used in your language. So, in the lexicon, you begin to recognize your own name in the first year. You have a first word long right around the first year. By a year and a half, you've got about 50 words. It's also considered a word spurt. By 2 years, you've got about 500 words. And by 4 years, you actually know how words are formed, and you're much more able to form different types of words using what these morphological elements. So those would be like, I'm driving, it's the biggest. They're different, like, so the ing or the est is a piece of a word that you then, by 4 years old, you're beginning to structure together. And now there's grammar in terms of um, putting words together in certain orders. That would be syntax to understand and communicate meaning. Um, and it's just useful to know that there are different theories of language acquisition. There's the learning theory, which you can sort of associate with Skinner, who believed that it was through conditioning and reinforcement and shaping that language develops. But Chomsky is known as championing the idea that you're born with a language acquisition device in your head, that you have an innate predisposition to have nouns, verbs, sentence structure, and order, and that there's this universal grammar. It doesn't mean that my nouns and verbs are always going to be in the same order. If I go to Germany, they put um, the subject at the end. You'll see. And those of you who speak different, Spanish and English is pretty similar in terms of like word order. It's very similar. They're both very influenced by the Romance languages of Latin. Um, and there are regions of the brain that are specifically designed for different types of language processing. So this is all stuff that goes toward the idea that language is something that we're predisposed to do. If you remember things that I've said in past lectures, I also believe that emotions are things that we're predisposed to do. And if you think about what Vygotsky said in terms of these learning processes of attention and memory, um, those types of things are also processes that we're innately born to do. And then all of that combines together to be very flexible, to allow us to learn any language that anybody can come up with, you know, even computer languages. And then the interactionist approach basically says, yeah, it takes both. It's not just native. You still have to have all this learning theory involved. Now, one of the things that I think is beautiful about language is just um, the will to communicate. So one, we're predisposed to learn words and learn grammar and use them in a way to communicate experience and thoughts and ideas. And here's this preschool child that is fascinating because he's a deaf child who was born of hearing parents, And he made, because the hearing parents, they didn't have sign language, and they didn't take him out, but he invented his own signs and actually communicates with his mother. So I'm going to take you into this video at 8 minutes in, and you're going to hear the researcher describe it a little bit.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the 2017 Ryerson Lecture. This lecture series has been given every year since 1974.
And their hearing parents could have exposed them to a sign language, but they didn't know one. And so they didn't expose the kids to a sign language. So for all intents and purposes, these children are lacking linguistic input. They have speech that they can't make use of, and they don't have sign, which they could make use of. So what do? I mean, one might think that they'd sit in a corner and play marbles by themselves, but in fact what they do is communicate. And they turn to gesture to communicate, and those gestures are called home signs. So what I'd like to do first is just to give you an example of a home signer, a deaf child born to hearing parents in the United States. This is a child sitting in front of a Richard Scarry book, which for those of you who know the literature is the best word book ever. It's a really good book. He's sitting in front of the book. He points at the picture of a shovel stuck in sand. And what he does is he goes and he tells us about that. He says, you can shovel. And then he starts to get an idea to tell a little story. He talks about the fact that these shovels, you can use snow shovels. When it snows and when you put on your boots, the shovels are used outside, but they're kept downstairs. It's a whole little story that he's telling us with his hands. There he goes.
Shovel, shovel.
Not in the winter time.
Oh, yeah,
You shovel in the winter time. Yeah.
outside?
When it's snowing.
Oh, when it's snowing, you got a shovel.
Snowing.
Right. Oh, I see. Where's the shovel?
Where is it? It's in the garage.
There it is. Downstairs. Oh, there's the shovel. Oh, there.
So this work was
Isn't
done
that so
collaboratively with Lila
cute?
Gleitman.
Okay. Like, I just love his little smile when he seems, when he gets the feeling that she got it. And he gives him the little smile that is down in the garage. Like, there's just something beautiful to me about the human spirit that just says, hey, I'm here and I'm going to talk to you with whatever I've got available. And then it's also like, nice job, Mom. Obviously, he's talking to a researcher here, but in the background, you can hear the mom, and you can see that she's really trying and facilitating his ability to communicate. If you're interested in this, go ahead and watch the whole thing. She's fascinating, this particular researcher, and she does a great job presenting her work. So now we're getting a little bit more into the preschool age, where grammar comes online and private speech becomes a big deal. Pragmatics of language is the aspect of language related to communicating effectively and appropriately with others. A pragmatic would be taking turns and not talking over each other. Social speech is speech that we are actually directed at another person, which is meant to be understood. So even in the little, even this guy, he was having social speech, even though it was signs, is he wanted her to understand it, which was adorable. And then remember we read in our book about the research that involved showing kids a picture of the wug. They would just show them this card, and the researcher would say, this is a wug. Obviously, the kids can't read, but the researcher would say, this is a wug. And now there are two of them. There are two. And then she would wait, and the child would say, wugs. And that was some of the first research that showed that preschoolers are using the rules of language. So one of the rules of language is if there's more than one thing, you put a z or an s or a z at the end of it, and that means there's two. So why this was proof that they were using those rules is because these were all made up words. in this research that they did, that nobody, they couldn't have possibly known that this was a wug because the researchers made it up. So the only way that they could have completed this sentence is if they had internalized and were applying the rules of making nouns plural, more than one of them. Another thing to think about with language is it's really important to understand that poverty has an effect on language development. Now, that's not to say, oh, if you're poor, your child isn't going to learn to speak, but there are real ramifications of people with lower incomes. And so in this research, they were basically comparing parents who were professionals to parents who were on welfare. So those was a pretty big spread. And what they found is that those on welfare had less interaction per hour with when they were observed with their children. So professionals, for whatever reason, maybe they didn't have to work as gruelingly hard and had more energy when they got home, or maybe, but they were able to spend more time interacting with their children per hour. Also, parents who were on welfare exposed their children to fewer words. So they just spoke less. There were fewer words. The range of words used in the child's experience was just smaller. And so then the researchers calculated the difference. By age 4, the children had heard 13 million fewer words because they spoke less in the family. And the parents were more likely to use the language of prohibition. So there was not only was there a difference in the quantity of words used among the parents in poverty, but they were more likely to use the language of prohibition. The quality of the language seemed to be different. Children were more likely to hear no and stop. Now, no way do I think that poor people deserve this and that they're in any way different than you and me, other than the experience, the drain, the worry, the frustration can all add up to having less to say to your children or being stressed enough that all you can say is stop it. And so this is, I really think this research is interesting and is important for us to think about when we think about income inequality and how that is getting more and more pronounced in our world. Now let's talk a little bit about childcare in preschool. Our book talked about the difference between the constructivist perspective and an academic perspective. So there's this idea that knowledge is constructed, and that's really focusing more on learning to learn than learning a set amount of skills or information. So in an academic, in an academically minded preschool, it's more focusing on the idea that there's something out there, there's a body of knowledge, and it's got to be learned. You have to take in the information and remember it. And so it's all about achievement and mastery instead of the process of learning. So the constructivist perspective tends to be more child-centered, more focused on experiential. Oh, looks like I misspelled that. And developmentally appropriate. So what is this child at, and what are they interested in, and what are they ready for, and what can they experience that will really allow them to learn? And the academic perspective is more like the rote, like let's memorize our ABCs and let's memorize our plus tables and I don't think that they're doing their too much arithmetic in preschool, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They're learning things by rote instead of by experience in this perspective. And they're trying to like master the skills to show that they've done it. One of the things that is worth thinking about when thinking about either preschool or childcare is whether or not it is high quality. And our book talked about the difference between, say, a high quality Head Start or a not high quality Head Start. They said that about 40% of the thousands of Head Starts in America are not considered to be high quality. And so, what I thought would be nice for you is to have a sense of what the experts consider to be high quality. And so, here are some factors that are considered when thinking about high quality childcare: that the staff is well trained, that the ratio of care providers to children is reasonable, that it's age appropriate. So, 3-year-olds need more caregivers than 4 or 5-year-olds in that ratio. There's a planned curriculum. It's not just willy-nilly, what are we going to do today? But they're planning something out. There's a rich language environment, lots being said, and there's ample conversation back and forth. That there's a sensitivity to the emotional needs of the children, and the activities are age appropriate. Not just like being parked in front of a TV. Um, and I'll just give you an aside on that. I sent my child when I lived in New York to not a high quality childcare, and he hates me. No, he doesn't hate me for it, but like he he was so offended by the fact that they parked everybody in front of the TV, and I don't think he would have minded if it was like good TV, but it was like some McDonald's cartoon. And he was just so offended by the idea that they would sit down and make him watch an ad. Anyway, and he was just a tiny little thing. He was just 3 or 4. All right, that there's basic health and safety standards, vision and hearing screening, that they're alert to can the child see and can the child hear. And there's at least one meal a day, and that the facility should provide at least one family support service. So these would be aspects of high quality childcare. It's worth thinking about. And I thought this also didn't come from our book, but it came from somewhere else. And I thought it was really interesting that when they asked parents about the purpose of preschool in China, Japan, and the US, they came up with a different emphasis. So in China, when parents responded to the question of what is the purpose of preschool, their response was to give a good start academically. That's the purpose. In Japan, the purpose of preschool was to help the child to become part of a group. Like group functioning was the utmost in Japan. When they asked the parents in the United States, what is the purpose of a preschool? Their response tended to be more to make the children more self-reliant. I love this finding because it's such an encapsulation of really important cultural differences. Um, and this becomes, as we talk more about this concept of bicultural identity, and we get more into that later on, you're going to see that one of the biggest challenges of bicultural identity is when there is a mismatch of these fundamental values. Like the fundamental value of being self reliant is particularly strong in the United States, and it's not shared by every culture that comes to live here. So it can become difficult to navigate for children who have to be both raised by parents from a different culture and integrated into the US culture when the values collide. Okay. And then the last bit that we're going to talk about here is reading to children. And this is a peer review article. I'm not linking to it, but it's a peer review article that really looks at the key to early literacy development. And if what you want is your child to sort of become an early reader, which it's possible for your child to start reading before or right around preschool. They don't have to wait till kindergarten. What it involves is not just reading the story to your child. That's not enough to get this kind of result. What it takes is enriched reading. And I wanted to give you a sense of what enriched reading is like when working with preschoolers. so that's focusing not only with the meaning of the story. You're not just looking at the meaning of the story. You're also engaging with the print itself. You're identifying the letters and sounding them out as you go. So you're actually, by the enriched reading, is engaging in the process of reading while moving through the meaning of the story. And so that's what this researcher found in terms of the advantage of enriched reading to children. That's all we have to say about preschool and infant language development, and we will see you next time.